October 19, 1944, Philippine Sea, 150 miles east of Luzon. The steel deck of the USS Intrepid pitched violently beneath Seaman First Class Robert Hayes as he secured ammunition belts against the hurricane-force winds. Salt spray stung his eyes like needles, and the roar of Typhoon Louise drowned out even the ship's claxons. Waves towering 40 feet above the flight deck crashed over the carrier's bow, sending torrents of seawater cascading across the hangar bay. In the churning darkness, Hayes could barely make out the silhouettes of destroyers riding the mountainous swells, their searchlights cutting futile beams through the storm's fury. 300 miles away, on the beaches of Leyte, Japanese Lieutenant Hiroshi Yamamoto crouched in his reinforced bunker, listening to the typhoon's howl above the concrete. Through the storm's violence, he heard something that chilled him more than the wind. The distant rumble of American naval guns still firing through the tempest. The sound of those shells, arriving with mechanical precision despite nature's assault, carried a message that would haunt the Japanese garrison through the long night. The Americans were still coming. October 1944 marked a turning point not merely in the Pacific War's strategic balance, but in the fundamental understanding of what industrial democracy could achieve when pushed to its absolute limits. As Typhoon Louise swept across the Philippine Sea with winds exceeding 140 miles per hour, it presented both American and Japanese forces with a test that would reveal the true nature of their respective war machines. For the Japanese Empire, typhoons had always been divine wind, kamikaze, that protected the homeland from foreign invasion. The great storm that scattered Kublai Khan's fleet in 1274 remained embedded in Japanese military consciousness as proof that nature itself fought for the emperor. But October 1944 would prove that American industrial might could transform even nature's most violent tantrums into mere tactical inconveniences. While Japanese commanders expected the typhoon to halt American operations for weeks, they watched in growing disbelief as Task Force 38 maintained its relentless advance through conditions that should have sent any rational navy fleeing for safe harbor. The sound that would come to symbolize this impossible persistence was not the roar of engines or the crack of gunfire, but the steady, mechanical rhythm of American ship horns, foghorns that cut through typhoon winds with the same inexorable precision that characterized every aspect of the American war effort. The Japanese military leadership had built their Pacific strategy around certain assumptions about the limitations imposed by geography and weather. The vast distances of the Pacific, the seasonal typhoon patterns, the coral atolls and jungle-covered mountains, all were seen as natural allies that would exhaust American resolve and strain their supply lines to the breaking point. General Tomoyuki Yamashita, commanding Japanese forces in the Philippines, had specifically positioned his defensive lines to take advantage of the October typhoon season, believing that American amphibious operations would be impossible during the storm period. Weather data from October 19, 1944. Typhoon Louise, wind speeds 140 plus mph, wave heights 35 to 45 feet, visibility less than 100 yards. American naval operations continued without interruption. Japanese defensive preparations halted due to weather conditions. U.S. Task Force 38 operational status 100% combat effective. What Yamashita and his staff could not comprehend was that American naval architecture and logistics had been designed from the beginning to operate in conditions that would cripple other navies. The Essex-class carriers that formed the backbone of Task Force 38 had been built not merely to project power, but to maintain that projection regardless of environmental conditions. Each carrier carried specialized meteorological equipment, storm-hardened communications arrays, and, most critically, the industrial capacity to perform major repairs at sea during combat operations. As Typhoon Louise reached its peak intensity on the morning of October 20th, Japanese radio intercepts picked up American operational communications that revealed the true scope of their miscalculation. While Japanese forces hunkered down in bunkers and caves, waiting for the storm to pass, American ships were using the Typhoon's cover to approach closer to their targets than ever before. The storm that was supposed to protect Japanese positions had become their greatest vulnerability. The Americans fight through everything: storms, darkness, our strongest positions. They bring their factories with them across the ocean. How can we compete with a nation that treats typhoons as minor inconveniences? From the diary of Captain Masahiro Ito, Japanese Navy, recovered after the war. The foghorns that echoed across the Philippine Sea carried more than navigation signals. They announced the arrival of a new form of warfare that made weather irrelevant. Every 2 minutes, precisely timed, the horns of dozens of American vessels would sound in sequence, creating a maritime symphony that demonstrated perfect coordination despite zero visibility. Japanese listening posts recorded these signals with growing amazement, noting that American ships maintained formation and timing with mechanical precision, even as individual vessels pitched and rolled through waves that dwarfed any storm Japanese sailors had experienced. Lieutenant Commander James Mitchell, aboard the destroyer USS O'Brien, later recorded his observations of the typhoon operations in his action report. Weather conditions extreme, visibility 0, seas running 40-45 feet. Maintained station and continued bombardment schedule per operational orders. Japanese return fire sporadic and ineffective. Apparently, they did not expect us to operate in these conditions. Mitchell's matter-of-fact tone captured the essential American approach to the typhoon challenge: adapt, overcome, and maintain pressure regardless of conditions. The technical capabilities that allowed American forces to operate through Typhoon Louise represented the culmination of industrial innovations that had been developing since the war's beginning. Radar systems that could penetrate storm interference, gyroscopic stabilizers that kept gun platforms level in heavy seas, and communication equipment that functioned despite electrical storms. All were products of an industrial democracy that treated seemingly impossible challenges as engineering problems to be solved. But the Japanese defenders experienced something beyond mere tactical surprise. As American bombardments continued through the typhoon's worst hours, many Japanese soldiers began to question fundamental assumptions about the war itself. Private Kenji Nakamura, stationed on a beach defense position near Tacloban, wrote to his brother on October 21st, "The storm gods have abandoned us. The Americans sail through divine wind as if it were summer breeze. What kind of enemy fights heaven itself and wins?" The psychological impact of the typhoon operations extended far beyond individual units. Japanese military doctrine had emphasized spiritual strength and natural advantages as force multipliers that could overcome material disadvantages. When Typhoon Louise failed to even slow American operations, it shattered a core belief system that had sustained Japanese resistance since Pearl Harbor. If Americans could fight through typhoons, what natural barrier could possibly stop them? Operational comparison. October 20th, 1944. Japanese sorties flown during typhoon. 0 American sorties flown during typhoon. 127 Japanese naval movements. All suspended American naval movements. Accelerated under storm cover. Shore bombardment missions continued on schedule. The foghorns continued their mechanical chorus throughout October 21st as Typhoon Louise finally began to weaken. But their significance had evolved beyond mere navigation aids. Each blast represented American industrial capacity made audible, the sound of a nation that manufactured solutions to every challenge, including acts of God. Japanese radio operators, monitoring American frequencies, reported that the foghorns were being used to coordinate complex maneuvers that would have been impossible for any other navy to attempt. As visibility began to improve on October 22nd, Japanese observers received their first clear view of what American determination looked like in practice. Task Force 38 emerged from the Typhoon in perfect formation, not a single vessel lost, with air operations resuming immediately despite damaged flight decks and storm-battered aircraft. The sight of American carriers launching strikes within hours of surviving a Category 4 typhoon represented a fundamental shift in the Pacific War's momentum. Admiral William Bull Halsey, commanding Task Force 38, summarized the typhoon operations in his post-action report. Enemy appeared to expect typhoon conditions to halt our advance. Instead, we used storm cover to close range and intensify pressure. Weather is a tactical factor, not a strategic limitation. Halsey's assessment captured the American approach that so confounded Japanese planners, the treatment of environmental challenges as problems to be solved rather than obstacles to be avoided. The Japanese response to the typhoon operations revealed deep-seated cultural and strategic miscalculations that extended far beyond weather prediction. General Yamashita's defensive plans had been built around the assumption that Americans, like all previous foreign armies, would respect the power of natural forces. The discovery that Americans treated typhoons as tactical opportunities rather than strategic pauses forced a complete re-evaluation of Japanese defensive strategy. We prepared to fight American soldiers. We were not prepared to fight American factories. They bring their entire industrial system with them across the ocean, then use it to defeat weather itself. Interrogation transcript. Colonel Takeshi Hayashi, captured January 1945. The transformation in Japanese military thinking following the typhoon operations can be traced through captured documents and post-war interviews. Before October 1944, Japanese defensive planning consistently relied on environmental factors to disrupt American timetables and supply lines. After Typhoon Louise, Japanese commanders began planning for the assumption that Americans would maintain operational tempo regardless of conditions. This shift represented more than tactical adaptation. It revealed the collapse of Japanese confidence in their ability to exploit any natural advantage against American industrial power. If typhoons could not stop American operations, what force on earth possibly could? The psychological impact rippled through Japanese ranks, from individual soldiers to high command, contributing to the growing sense that they were fighting not just another army, but an entirely different form of civilization. The foghorns that had guided American ships through Typhoon Louise continued to sound as Task Force 38 proceeded with its mission of supporting the Leyte landings. But their significance had transcended their original purpose. They had become the audible symbol of American industrial democracy's approach to warfare. Mechanical, precise, unstoppable, and utterly indifferent to obstacles that would halt any other military force. The Leyte operations that followed demonstrated how thoroughly the Typhoon experience had changed the strategic dynamic. American forces, having proven they could operate through the worst weather the Pacific could produce, pressed their advantage with accelerated timetables that gave Japanese defenders no opportunity to regroup or reinforce. The Ormoc Bay landings, originally scheduled for November, were moved up to early November specifically because American commanders knew Japanese forces were still reeling from the psychological impact of the Typhoon operations. Japanese defensive positions that had been carefully coordinated to take advantage of seasonal weather patterns found themselves isolated and vulnerable. Supply lines that depended on typhoon seasons to provide respite from American interdiction remained under constant pressure. Most critically, the Japanese ability to predict and plan for American operational tempo had been shattered by the demonstration that environmental factors held no power over American logistics. Strategic Impact Assessment. November 1944. Japanese reinforcement missions to Philippines. Reduced by 70% American operational tempo. Increased by 40% Japanese defensive planning. Completely restructured duration of Philippine campaign. Shortened by estimated 4 months. The December 1944 typhoon season provided additional confirmation of American capabilities that Japanese forces had hoped might prove to be exceptional circumstances. When Typhoon Cobra struck Task Force 38 on December 18th, Japanese intelligence expected major American losses and operational delays. Instead, they observed American forces treating the second typhoon as a routine challenge, implementing lessons learned from the October operations. The mechanical precision of American responses to Typhoon Cobra revealed the extent to which fighting through extreme weather had become standard operating procedure. Foghorns continued their coordinated signals, damage control teams performed their functions with practiced efficiency, and operational schedules remained unchanged. What had seemed impossible in October had become routine by December. Japanese radio intercepts from this period reveal growing desperation in military communications. References to weather immunity and factory fleets appeared frequently in Japanese intelligence reports, along with increasingly frantic requests for guidance on how to plan defenses against an enemy that seemed unaffected by environmental conditions that crippled Japanese operations. The spring 1945 approach to Okinawa eliminated any remaining Japanese hopes that seasonal weather patterns might provide strategic advantages. American forces demonstrated their typhoon fighting capabilities so consistently that Japanese planners abandoned weather-dependent defensive strategies entirely. The Okinawa campaign was planned by Japanese. Commanders who assumed American operations would continue regardless of conditions, a fundamental shift in strategic thinking that had begun with the foghorns of October. 1944. Private First Class William Chen, serving aboard the USS Essex during the Okinawa approaches, recorded his impressions of how routine typhoon operations had become. Third big storm this deployment. Barely mentioned in the ship's log. Kept regular watch schedule, maintained flight ops, hit our targets on time. Weather's just another factor to calculate, like fuel consumption or ammunition expenditure. Amazing how fast you adapt to the impossible. The American ships sound their horns in perfect sequence, even when they cannot see each other through the storm. This is not seamanship. This is machinery made into a military force. How do we fight machines that never tire, never doubt, never retreat? Final diary entry, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, April 1945. The industrial democracy that enabled American typhoon operations represented a fundamental transformation in the nature of military power. Previous wars had been contests between armies or navies, limited by geography, weather, and logistics. The Pacific War revealed a new form of military organization that treated environmental challenges as engineering problems to be solved through industrial application. The foghorns that had guided American ships through multiple typhoons carried implications that extended far beyond naval tactics. They announced the arrival of a military force that brought its entire industrial base with it across the ocean, then used that industrial capacity to negate traditional military limitations. Weather, distance, and geography, the eternal constants of military planning, had become variables to be controlled through technological application. Japanese military leaders, trained in a tradition that emphasized adaptation to environmental conditions, found themselves confronting an enemy that simply changed the environment to suit their operational requirements. American bases transformed coral atolls into major industrial facilities within months. American logistics turned vast Pacific distances into routine supply runs. American meteorology turned typhoons into tactical opportunities. The transformation this represented can be measured in the evolution of Japanese strategic planning from 1944 to 1945. Early, war plans had consistently relied on environmental factors to multiply Japanese defensive advantages. By war's end, Japanese planners operated under the assumption that American forces would maintain full operational capability regardless of conditions. The psychological impact of this shift contributed significantly to the collapse of Japanese military morale during the final year of the war. The mechanical rhythm of American foghorns, sounding their precise intervals through storm after storm, had become the audible signature of a new form of military power. Each blast represented the industrial capacity that allowed American forces to treat the Pacific Ocean as an American lake, regardless of weather conditions. The sound carried across the water not just navigation information, but a message about the nature of industrial democracy applied to warfare. Cumulative typhoon operations, October 1944 to August 1945. Major typhoons encountered. 1234. American operations suspended due to weather. 0 Japanese operations suspended due to weather. 847. Strategic advantage gained through weather operations. Decisive. The final typhoon encounter of the Pacific War occurred on August 10, 1945, as American forces prepared for the planned invasion of Japan. Typhoon Grace, with winds exceeding 150 miles per hour, struck the assembled invasion fleet with greater intensity than any previous storm. Japanese radio monitoring stations, still operational despite the destruction of most major cities, listened for signs that this unprecedented storm might finally halt American operations. Instead, they heard the familiar sequence of foghorns, maintaining perfect coordination through the storm's fury. American preparations for Operation Downfall continued on schedule, with landing craft and support vessels riding out waves that dwarfed anything previously encountered. The mechanical precision of American operations through Typhoon Grace provided final confirmation that weather had become irrelevant to American strategic planning. The surrender announcement on August 15th prevented the final demonstration of American typhoon fighting capabilities. But Japanese military leaders who participated in surrender negotiations consistently cited weather operations as evidence of American industrial superiority that made continued resistance meaningless. The ability to fight through typhoons had become symbolic of broader American advantages that Japanese industry and organization could never match. Post-war interviews with Japanese commanders revealed the profound psychological impact of American typhoon operations on military planning and morale. The consistent theme was disbelief that any military force could maintain operational effectiveness under conditions that reduced Japanese forces to mere survival. The Americans had not simply defeated Japanese armies, they had defeated nature itself, removing the last ally upon which Japanese strategy had depended. The foghorns fell silent on August 15, 1945, their mechanical chorus replaced by the quiet sounds of peace returning to the Pacific. But their message echoed across the post-war world with implications that extended far beyond military tactics. Those precise, coordinated blasts through the worst storms the ocean could produce had announced the arrival of a new form of civilization, one that treated the impossible as merely difficult, and the difficult as routine engineering challenges. In the end, Japanese soldiers could not believe Americans fought through typhoons because they could not comprehend a society that industrialized solutions to every problem, including acts of God. The foghorns that guided American ships through storm after storm carried the sound of democratic abundance made manifest, the mechanical rhythm of a nation that brought its factories across the ocean and used them to defeat weather itself. The typhoons that were meant to be Japan's divine protection had become highways for American advance. Their fury transformed into tactical cover through industrial application. In those storm-darkened seas, lit only by the precise navigation lights of Task Force 38, the true nature of the Pacific War was revealed. Not a contest between armies, but between different concepts of human possibility. One side believed in accommodation to natural limitations. The other believed in the elimination of limitations through organized effort. The Americans won not because they were braver or more determined than their enemies, but because they had created a form of military organization that made bravery and determination irrelevant. The foghorns that sounded through every typhoon announced the victory of systematic abundance over individual heroism. of industrial democracy over warrior tradition, of mechanical precision over spiritual fervor. In the end, the Japanese could not believe Americans fought through typhoons because they could not imagine a civilization that treated the wrath of heaven as a minor scheduling inconvenience, to be overcome through proper logistics and adequate preparation. The sound of those horns, echoing across storm-swept seas, carried the music of a new world being born, one where human organization had grown powerful enough to make weather itself bend to strategic necessity.